So for our first speaker today, we have Taya Steere, who is joining us from Grammarly to talk about baking a red team from scratch.
Thank you, Jessica. Everybody hear me okay? Great. So, I've done this twice now, baking a red team from scratch. So I'm going to be talking about some of the complexities that come with trying to start a new red team and a lot of the things you need to consider before doing that. Real brief overview, I've been doing red teaming for, started pen testing and then red teaming for about 18 years now. So it's been a long time. Was here at Microsoft on the Azure red team for quite a while. Then was at Lyft, started a red team there, was at Amazon for a while, and now I'm working as I was the first red team hire at Grammarly. So I'm going to start with red teaming defined, and this is from a presentation that was given by Toby Konenberg a couple of years ago, and both of these talks are from other things, but really it's looking at everything from an adversarial perspective. It's not pen testing plus. We're actually out there trying to present a view of the risk that is based on what is happening in the real world to the extent possible within the risk environment of a business. And we're looking at that as an independent operation in most cases. We don't want to be dependent on the service teams or management to say what we can and cannot do within reason, because of course we're still a business function, but we need to have as much independence as possible so that we can provide a good risk assessment. And then the first thing you need to ask is, do you need a red team? Well, what are you trying to accomplish? If you're there just to check the software, the security of your software, or check if your your network intrusion system works or whatever, you can do that with a penetration testing team. You don't need a red team to do that. You can do that with off-the-shelf tools and consultants, and that's fine. Do you have a blue team? This is the most important question at all. If you don't have a blue team, you don't need a red team. You really don't, because the red team exists to sharpen the blue team in many cases. And if you don't have that position in place, you're going to have a red team generating a lot of findings that go nowhere, and they're going to get frustrated and unhappy. What sorts of adversarial information do you have? If you're out there to model your adversaries, how do you know? What do you know what the adversaries look like in your space? Do you have a threat intelligence team? Do you have sources you can pull this information from? Where are you going to base your emulations from? And what is your who are your threat actors? Again, that varies depending on where you're working for. If you have a large company is going to have more threat actors, but small companies still have to deal with ransomware and everything else. And if you're a company with a strong Ukrainian presence like Grammarly, we have, maybe the Russians might get upset at us because of things going on there. You have to think about who your adversaries are and really see, do you need to focus on a red team based on your adversary threat profile, or can you put that money better use elsewhere? And what is your criteria for success? It's not how many boxes the red team owns. It's what actually can be done based off the red team activities. And I'm going to get a little bit more into this later, because measuring red team success is hard. It's been a problem that's been around as long as red teams have been. But I'm going to go a little bit further into each of these, because these are really the big topics. But skilled red team operatives, not cheap. We are some of the most expensive security personnel you can find. And that comes with a significant investment. You need management buy-in, not just to the expense, but also to the risk that a red team brings. Where are you going to get your tools from? There's a lot of questions around tooling and what red team uses and what's available and what they can use. And what special skill sets do you need for your environment? A company that works largely in Windows and Azure is going to need a completely different skill set from a company that largely works with Linux and AWS. So what's your recruiting plan? If you're starting up a red team, you're going to have to find people who are seasoned. And you need some senior level experience. But those people also might not want to work for a green team that is out there just solving the basic issues and getting things started from scratch. So you need to have a plan in place to recruit the right people to put your team together. And a lot of this is finding people who have the experience but are also willing to build from the ground up. And that's going to be even rarer than just finding a quality red team operator. What are the incentives you're offering to keep those people around during the startup phase? Because it's going to take a while to get that red team going, and especially if you're leveling up your blue team at the same time, to get to the point where if somebody comes in from a vendor or contractor or another major company that's had established red teams before, they're going to be bored when they first get there. What is the incentive for them to do the job that you've hired them to do? And for somebody like me, that the incentive itself might be creating the program from scratch. And that might be what I'm interested in. But if you don't set that expectation at the beginning, you might be bringing someone in who's looking for something that you can't provide at the time. And really, how are you going to retrain those people? What value proposition do you have? You know, if you don't have the environment where they can keep their skills sharp, they're going to go somewhere else. So you still need to have some kind of training plan, or maybe you need to offer training that is better than what they were getting in their previous place, so they can keep their skills sharp while they're going through the startup phase. You're not going to see an immediate impact with a new red team. There's a lot of work that goes into getting off the ground, and at first it's going to be slow, especially when it comes to influencing your other teams like your blue teams. You're going to be building from nothing. You have a large ramp up time to start showing real results. And are they going to commit the resources needed to fix the red team findings? If your red team generates a bunch of findings but nobody fixes them, that's not going to be a very useful red team. And it requires resources to fix those findings. We can't just finish a report and dump it on somebody's desk and say we're done with it. That needs to be actioned, and that means that management needs to support product teams from maybe taking some time from launching the latest thing to actually fix the problem. What is the operational risk level management is willing to accept? Red team inherently carries risk if you're doing it correctly. You're out there probably messing around in systems that aren't designed to be messed around the way you're doing it. You're introducing business risk. You may be introducing some negative publicity risk if information got out about a compromise from an operation or something. What level are they willing to accept? And does it make sense to have a red team? If they're a very risk-adverse environment, then maybe you're just better off with pen testers if they're not going to let an red team operate like a red team. And they need to agree upon and support a rules of engagement. You can't just have a rules of engagement that is signed off by the CISO, but doesn't have buy-in from the operational management. Because if you come into their service environment and say, I have permission to do this, and they're like, well, you're impacting my business risk. I never signed off on this. I never agreed to it. They've got a very valid point. They're the ones actually taking the risk when it comes to it. So you need a wider agreement on that than just a CISO stamp saying you're good to go with your red team. Tool selection really depends on your operating environment. If you're in Windows land, there's a lot more tools available out there to you than if you're working in a Linux primary environment or even less than a Mac OS environment. Commercial tools tend to be very expensive for red teaming. You're usually operating on a per user license. Those licenses aren't cheap. They have annual renewals. So you're investing that in addition to all the money you're paying your red teamer. Even if you're just using open source tooling, they still require time to investigate the tool, test it, implement it, make sure it works with your environment, make sure you've accepted the risk that comes with that tooling, and know that you're going to be the one reliable for supporting it. So that needs to be baked in as time investment. All tools require some ramp-up time to use effectively. You're not going to be a successful red team if you install Cobalt Strike out of the box and just get up and go. You need to spend time learning it, how to configure it, how to work with profiles, and make it actually usable. Building in-house is great, especially when you have dedicated dev resources, but that's probably going to be even more expensive. A lot of times coming up with tools from nothing is great because you can customize it to your environment, but that requires not only the development time for the tool, but then you have to support it operationally afterwards. I have been on the hook for supporting several red team tools after they've been developed, and let's say a lot of times after a year of supporting it, you probably just want to get back to red teaming, not supporting the tool you've worked on. So that needs to be considered when you're looking at developing in-house tools. And I'm going to take a moment to plug Cartography because it's a project that I worked on previously and I'm a big fan of it. It is an open source tool for mapping relationships across various clouds. If you're familiar with Bloodhound, which is for Windows environments, this is a graph database that does it across cloud environments, across resource providers like Okta, GitHub, and lets you map those permissions in your environment. So big fan of that project. They still have ongoing development. And one of my first tasks at Grammarly is actually getting that implemented for us. So again, what's your primary operating environment? If you're Windows, not only are you going to be able to find experienced red teamers easier, your tooling is going to be easier. People know it better. But if you're looking at like a Mac OS heavy environment, there's less specialization, less expertise for working in that environment, less people who know how to write exploits and develop good security tools. There's very little in the way of like commercial tooling for those environments. You're going to be left with open source and working on your own more. If you're working in a heavy G Suite environment, you're not going to have your good old Excel macros to go to constantly like every other adversary in the world uses. Do you have expertise in the programming languages used? You know, if I've worked in Python shops where I'm very proficient and can understand the code really well. I've worked in Java shops where I'd rather beat my head against the desk than work with their code. It just depends on what they have, and you need to make sure you're finding the right people to fill these roles and have some level of expertise or at least familiarity in the environment they're working in. Do you have a lot of web apps? Are you a web app focused company? You need someone with experience working in web apps in that case. A lot of red teamers have been trained more on the network side doing pivoting and everything, but if your main way in is through web apps, you need someone with web app expertise to get that ball rolling. And then what clouds do you use? And someone who's familiar with Azure is going to be different than somebody familiar with AWS. You may understand the similarities between the two because all clouds have the same fundamental features, but if you're talking about red teaming, you need to go beyond the fundamentals. You need to really understand the permissioning models, how resources are shared, how they work, how identity management works. That's the critical one. And those are largely different between the clouds. So having the right expertise in the cloud environment the company works on is another big consideration. And I just hit the wrong button. So you got all your pieces together. What are you going to do with your team once you've assembled them? Well, the first thing is, how are you going to work with your blue team? Again, as I said, a fundamental component of the red team is influencing and improving the blue team. If my work doesn't impact the blue team, I'm failing as a red teamer. How does it work within your larger security program? And an internal red team is just one component in the larger program. We're there to provide actionable feedback based on real-world threats. But if that doesn't work with the existing program and doesn't provide value, then the red team might as well not be there. Do you have the security intelligence? I mentioned this earlier, but it's really important. You know, especially in smaller companies, there are areas where you're working on a very specialized team. You might not have this information, so you're going to have to develop it yourself as the red team probably, which is going to mean that you're splitting your work even more, or you need some red teamers with threat intelligence experience as well. Again, this goes into building your work team and knowing what you need to do, but you need to be able to have that base of knowledge in order to successfully be a red teamer and emulate these adversaries. And how do you define your objectives and hypothesis? You know, I like to look at red teaming as a hypothesis-driven workflow. You know, my hypothesis is I can compromise this system because the identity controls are weak. And how am I going to test that? You know, my objective might be to obtain credit card information, for example. My hypothesis is going to be this identity control system is weak. I'm going to go this way. And this is similar to how this adversary does it. So ultimately, I'm testing a hypothesis. The red team is, in a lot of ways, I think should be run scientifically. And you're looking at the point where eventually you have to either accept you've proven your hypothesis, which is easy, or get to a point where you accept that it's been disproven to a reasonable extent and move on. And I keep hitting the wrong button. So, you know, how do things look at the beginning? First projects are more likely to be pen tests than red team engagements. You're not going to have that information in place at first. You need to build those dossiers of your threat intelligence. You're probably going to be starting with very basic objectives and hypothesis, like scanning the external network for entry points. That is a very common first task that security teams might want you to have to do when they bring on a new red team. How do you identify the greatest risks? Well, asking the operations teams a really great start here. Reach out and find out where people's skeletons are buried and what they think the biggest risks to their services are. And that can be the starting point for the red team to work on. And focus on those big risk areas first to provide the value you can. You're going to need time to learn the environment. You're not going to be a very efficient team for at least 6 months. You know, and maybe more depending on the complexity of your environment. A good red teamer will know the environment as good as the platform team or the build team that is out there running your CI/CD infrastructure, because you need to understand how all those components work together. Stay just ahead of the blue team. If you come in with, you know, the absolute quietest you can, using nothing but ODAs you've developed yourself, and your blue team is still trying to implement EDR, you're wasting a lot of resources that you don't need. So try to keep that balance and stay just ahead of them where you're pushing them forward, but you're not overwhelming them. And this is when you develop your evidence gathering and reporting and readout processes. Getting the right stakeholders in the room for those readouts is critical. If you don't have, if you're just reading out to the security org, you're not involving the people who actually need to make these changes. Or if you're just reading out to the operational level, management doesn't have a good view on what you're doing. You need to, you know, define this process and how it's going to be played out. And that's going to require some tweaking. You're not going to get it right on the first try. Evidence collection is really important. If you're working in an environment with credit card numbers, what is your policy around exfiltrating credit card numbers? Do you never do it? Do you only do it in a test environment? Do you validate on a team member's credit card? I've seen that done before. But you need to define those ahead of time so that when it comes time for the operators to do this, they can do it with a risk level that has been accepted by management. And when you get done a test, you know, how do you know you've met your objective or fulfilled your hypothesis? This is a big question, especially when you're doing these operations which might be more open-ended. And say, you know, going back to that identity system example, how do I know when I've thoroughly exhausted what I can do? Maybe it's based on the skill level of your red teamers. That is going to have some impact on that. Maybe it's based on a time commitment or a time block you have allotted for this exercise. But you need to define what those points are going to look like at the end goal of your operation. What is the evidence that you need to collect? Do you need to document everything you do? Is that a requirement? Do you need to work with a two-person rule where there's always oversight on what an operator's doing? Do you need to screenshot or logs, text logs sufficient? This all needs to be defined in advance so you know what you're expected to do. After an operation, look at the accepted rules of engagement. Did it hinder you in any way that you say, I could have done this or I could have found this information, but this rule prevented me from doing it? Or do you feel the rules are too lax? The red team should have feedback on there too, where they're saying this could have introduced too much risk if this happened and I shouldn't have this authority. But the rules of engagement should not be set in stone. It should be a feedback process going on to make sure that you have a right balance to do your job, but also manage risk to the organization. And is there something where your output can benefit from a purple team exercise? I like working with the blue teams. You know, I think my job is to make sure that they are trained and honed as much as possible in a lot of cases. If I can do an exercise where I'm involving them or know that this operation is going to have a dedicated response phase where we feed them intel and say, come and find us, and then we can play cat and mouse together for a while. You know, is that going to be part of your operations? Because again, that'll require resourcing for management. They need to make sure that the blue team is resourced to do this, and it's not going to be taking away from their job. and that they're allowing the red team to spend more time on doing these purple team engagements rather than wrapping up an operation and moving on. So, ready to serve. First one is really important to me. Bad recommendations will lose you more faith with operation teams than even causing downtime in a lot of cases. They don't want you to give you recommendations, get them recommendations that are unworkable or unfeasible. Sometimes it might be a big recommendation that requires an architecture change or something that can't be accomplished immediately. But there's a difference between that and a recommendation that makes no sense whatsoever, especially if you're just using an automated tool and saying, here's the output, this tool said this. Well, as a red teamer, you're expected to do more than that. You need to validate that that was actually an issue and show that there's risk to it, not just regurgitate what some tool told you. Your recommendation should cover prevent, detect, and respond. You're thinking like an adversary. You need to be able to cover the areas that an adversary will go through, not just say, I found this vulnerability in your app, fix this. You need to say, how could this have been detected earlier, and how could it be responded to if this did happen? Important for internal red teams. You're not a consultant. You don't get to just drop a report off and not show up at the company again for a year. You're there to help fix the problems. So work with the teams to fix them. Don't just drop your report off and move on. You're working there because you have security expertise to put to use, and you can help develop the solutions to your own problems. I've done time on a blue team writing detections for the stuff that I found, and it's not as easy as red teamers like to think. They're like, oh, you could have just detected this, and that would have been the end of it. Well, writing those detections is not that simple. And don't lose sight of the ultimate objective. You're there to improve the security of the organization, not just to pwn boxes. As much fun as it is to just compromise the Active Directory domain every time and say, I did a good job, give me a cookie, you're not accomplishing what the red team's really meant to accomplish. So at the end, what metrics are you using to measure red team success? Number of bugs filed is a terrible red team metric. I have seen that at companies before, because you're looking for, you can file a lot of bad bugs. That doesn't help anybody. So what do you actually define as success? And this is really hard as a red teamer, because we can't just write OKRs around the work we do, because it's very open-ended. So the OKR might just be finish 5 red team ops this year, but the real metrics are what change are you impacting in your organization and what's gotten done. What is your process for continual improvement? How do you work to refine that process and stay just ahead of the blue team? How do you work to improve your intelligence for the next op so you can be a better adversary emulation? What are your sources for collecting feedback? If you're not talking to the operational teams, you're not getting a good idea of how you did, because a lot of what they have to say about how you worked as a red team, how you responded, and how you cooperated with the team is just as important as asking, did you do your best technical job? Because ultimately, we're here to sell the value of the recommendations that we have, and we need to build a rapport with these teams that we work with. And what are you doing to mature the broader security program? They've invested a lot of money in you and the red team. So what are you doing to show value for it? If you're there just writing bugs that never get fixed or not finding issues, then you need to look at your process and see what's wrong and put feedback into that and improve to be a valuable part of the security program. Or you might end up writing detections instead of red teaming, because that has more value to the company. You're not going to be perfect on your first go. This is an iterative process like everything. You need to learn what you did and keep moving. There's no one way to red team. Try different things. Find out what works for your organization. That's going to be different at a small company than it is at a huge company like Microsoft that has multiple red teams, each focusing on a different area. We're not lone wolves. We're just one part of the security team. You need to develop those relationships, work together. I want to work as closely with the AppSec team as I do with the members of my red team, so I can know what they're seeing, what they're fixing, and see if what I am doing can feedback to improve their process, for example. And you know, as you mature, your operations are going to look more like purple team, where you're working closer to the blue team and you're making sure that you're providing feedback into their processes to improve everybody. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I'll be around the social hour later to answer questions.